Doc Holliday was nothing if not complicated. He was a drunk and a gambler, a deadly shootist, a consumptive, and quite possibly even a con artist. But at the same time, he was also an educated Southern gentleman and a graduate of dental school. He was liked by some, hated by many, and feared by, well, pretty much everybody. And despite dying at just 36 years of age, Holliday lived long enough to become a frontier legend, one that has since become almost synonymous with the Old West. But who was Doc Holliday, really? How'd such an educated man find himself in dusty outposts like Fort Griffin and Dodge City? How'd a drunken killer become best friends with a respected lawman like Wyatt Earp? And what exactly was it that caused Doc to head west in the first place? Was it unrequited love? Was it due to being diagnosed with tuberculosis? Or was he running from the law after gunning down a pair of freed slaves? And did he really stab Ed Bailey like they show in the movie Tombstone? Join me today as we discuss all of this and more, including Doc's childhood, his relationship with Big Nose Kate, and the very first time he ever met the aforementioned Wyatt Earp. Feels good to be back. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza.
Yeehaw!
John Henry Holliday was born in Fort Griffin, Georgia on August 14th, 1851. His father, Henry Burroughs Holliday, was a druggist by trade who, just a few years prior, had fought in Mexico under General Taylor. And upon returning home, he brought with him a young Hispanic boy who had been orphaned by the war. Henry adopted the kid to raise as his own, and not long after is when he got married to a Miss Alice Jane McKee, daughter of a well-to-do plantation owner. The pair would welcome their first child the following December, a girl they named Martha, but sadly she wouldn't make it past her first 6 months. And then, of course, just a little over a year later is when Alice gave birth to John Henry. Now, I did find at least one source claiming they had a total of 6 children, all of whom died in infancy other than John Henry. I'm not really sure how true that is, but either way, John, or Doc, as he would soon come to be known, would basically grow up as an only child. He did have that adopted brother I mentioned a moment ago, Francisco, but then again, Francisco was quite a bit older, and he had already moved out on his own by the time Doc was a toddler. That said, he would be close with several of his cousins, a little too close with one of them, if you catch my drift. In fact, when Doc's maternal grandparents passed away, his father became legal guardian of his mother's younger siblings, including 14-year-old Thomas, who became sort of an older brother figure. So even though Doc never had any blood siblings of his own, at least not that lived, he certainly wasn't lacking for companionship. And for the first decade or so of his life, things were pretty decent. His father prospered financially and started buying up land, while his mother absolutely doted on him, just doing her level best to pass on her faith and instill a proper sense of manners. Sounds like a pretty structured life, but then again, young Holliday was given an extraordinary amount of freedom, just like most other boys his age there in the South, at least the white ones. Per Holliday biographer Gary Roberts, quote, "At an early age, they learned independence, took to the fields and woods, and began their tutelage in hunting, the handling of firearms, and horseback riding. Courtesy, spirit, and firmness were all part of the curriculum of individualism the Southern sons learned, but care was taken not to undermine their self-confidence or pride." End of quote. Now, speaking of self-confidence, there is some indication that Doc was possibly born with a cleft palate. And when I say some indication, this comes from just one source and one source only, the wife of one of Doc's cousins. According to her, the cleft was corrected via surgery, but Holliday remained self-conscious, withdrawn, and a mama's boy. Like I said, there's only one source on this, and from what I understand, she never actually met Doc in person, so grain of salt, right? And that's another thing. Just a very brief disclaimer before we continue, but someone complained recently that I was a little too milquetoast, their words, not mine, and that I'm always going on and on about boring stuff like evidence and corroboration. And yeah, guilty as charged. This is a history show. We discuss historical people and events, and I do strive to be as historically accurate as possible. Whether or not Doc had a cleft palate is pretty inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, but this will not be the last time you hear me point out just how shaky the evidence is concerning certain aspects of his life. Doc never kept a journal, and he very rarely sat for interviews. That being the case, all we have to rely on, for the most part, are the words of others, some of whom liked and admired Holliday, and some who absolutely hated the man. Toss in rumors and sloppy reporting, and over time, the legend became so ingrained that it can be very difficult to separate fact from fiction. Just wanted to point that out. Like I said, this will not be the last time you hear me speculate on the veracity of certain events. It's not because I hate Doc Holliday or that I'm against fun or I have an agenda or anything like that. All I'm trying to do is to be as accurate as possible while hopefully being at least somewhat entertaining. Okay, so, like I was saying, while it does seem that Doc had a pretty decent childhood, this would change drastically with the onset of the Civil War. His family, who, by the way, did own slaves, would end up moving some 200 miles south to the town of Valdosta, mostly to avoid Sherman's march on Atlanta. And it's there in Valdosta, sadly, where Doc's mother would pass away from tuberculosis in September of 1866. Now, if you're not familiar, tuberculosis is an infectious disease that mostly affects the lungs. It's spread through the air via microscopic droplets, and once inhaled, it can lie dormant for years. Sometimes your body is able to sort of lock it down and you can live a somewhat normal life, at least for a while. But at other times, especially when you're worn down by stress or poor nutrition, it'll flare back up, usually in the form of a persistent cough, chest pain, fever, and exhaustion. Eventually, though, you'll wind up in bed, either from respiratory failure or organ malfunction or possibly even pneumonia due to a weakened immune system. In other words, it was not a quick death. Those who fell prey would grow weaker by the month as it slowly chewed its way through their lungs, and in some cases even spread into their bones or their brains. I didn't know this until recently, but back in the 19th century, tuberculosis was the leading cause of death here in the United States. I'm talking like 1 out of every 10 people. And the crazy part is, nobody even knew that it was infectious until the 1880s. There was some suspicion prior to that, but they really couldn't nail down how or why it was spread. Up until then, it was thought to be either hereditary or caused by hard living. Now, as traumatic as I'm sure it was for the then just 15-year-old Holliday to lose his mother, his father seemed to move on rather quickly, remarrying just 3 months later to 23-year-old Rachel Martin. A turn of events that reportedly caused Doc to become quite sullen. And yeah, I bet. Not only was he still mourning the death of his mother, but now he's got a stepmom young enough to be his sister. But hey, life goes on, right? Doc would continue his schooling right there in Valdosta at the very fancy-sounding Valdosta Institute. This is also around the same time that he first showed an inclination towards violence. Apparently, he and a classmate got into an argument and decided to settle things with a good old-fashioned duel. Kind of. It was just supposed to be a mock duel, with him and his opponent using pistols that were only charged with powder. But I guess young Doc had other plans, showing up with a fully loaded pistol, looking to play for blood. Luckily, cooler heads prevailed, and his classmate offered up what I can only assume was a very sincere apology, and that was that. Now, eventually, in the fall of 1870, Doc would head to Philadelphia to enroll in dental school, a choice likely influenced by another young man there in Valdosta who had recently done the same, as well as his physician uncle, John Stiles. Per historian Mark Lee Gardner, quote, John Henry chose one of the best dental schools in the country, the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery in Philadelphia, where he began his studies in September of 1870. Among the several requirements to graduate, dental students needed to complete a minimum of 2 full courses of lectures, serve an internship with a private practice, and write a thesis. End of quote. And yeah, Doc graduated just a year and a half later, at which point he got himself a job as a dentist over in Atlanta, or as I like to call it, Hotlanta. Now, that said, there are additional stories claiming that Doc initially headed to St. Louis after graduation, and it was there where he first met a young lady going by the name of Kate Fisher, also known as Big Nose Kate. Originally from Hungary, Miss Fisher, whose real name, by the way, was Mary Catherine Haroni, immigrated to the United States with her family when she was around 10 years old. Sadly, within just a few years, both of her parents were dead, and Kate was on her own. And although she'd later claimed to have attended school in St. Louis, records do indicate that she was actually working there as a prostitute as early as 1870. Now, the only source showing that Holliday was in St. Louis, or that it was there where he initially met Kate, comes from Kate herself. And while I don't think that she should be completely discounted, many of her recollections are riddled with inaccuracies. And to once again quote historian Mark Lee Gardner, to date, no contemporary evidence has surfaced documenting Holliday's presence in St. Louis in 1872. And look, I'm not going to definitively say that Doc was not in St. Louis, but we just don't have any evidence of it one way or the other than Cade, and unfortunately, she's just not that reliable of a source. We do, however, know that he went to Atlanta, just not for very long. His dental partner came down with a case of tuberculosis, his uncle Robert died, and then early on in 1873 is when his adopted brother Francisco also passed away from, you guessed it, tuberculosis. So, that being the case, Doc headed back to his old hometown of Griffin, and then from there back to Valdosta. Once again, though, just not for very long. In fact, by the summer of 1873, Holliday would be residing in the bustling metropolis of Dallas, Texas. Now, as to why Doc made such an abrupt move, we'll likely never know for certain. One of the more popular narratives is that he was diagnosed with tuberculosis and he headed west for a drier climate, or what was referred to in those days as the Western cure. I do think this is very plausible, especially considering that Doc was indeed examined by his own uncle, the physician, and diagnosed as a consumptive around the same time that he was living in Atlanta. But this may not necessarily be the only reason the Doc headed west. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to Dallas or not, but it ain't exactly the gold standard when it comes to dry air, especially in the summertime. Although not quite as humid as Georgia, Dallas does get very, very muggy, to the point that it can sometimes feel like you're breathing in water. So if Holliday really did head west for a drier climate, I'd say Dallas was a poor choice. Another possible explanation is his first cousin Maddie. Now, I haven't brought her up just yet, but Maddie was the daughter of the Uncle Robert I mentioned a moment ago. She and Doc were said to have been very, very close, to the point that many have speculated that they were romantically involved. There was just one problem, though. You see, Maddie was a devout Catholic, and canon law didn't allow marriage between first cousins. There were also rumors that the family didn't approve of the relationship. Now, we'll talk more about Maddie later on. She and Doc would actually stay in contact for pretty much the remainder of his life. But there is a third theory as to why he left Georgia. Apparently, there was this popular swimming hole just outside of Valdosta, and I guess Doc, being a son of the South, didn't much like the idea of sharing it with people of color. He tried putting the unwanted swimmers on notice, but they failed to take heed, so he came back with a shotgun. He once again told them to get gone, and when they hesitated, he opened fire, killing 2 and wounding several others. Legend has it that the local law wasn't really all that concerned, but I guess Doc's family was, and they felt like it would be a good idea for him to make himself scarce. So he headed for Dallas. But did this really happen? Well, as it turns out, there's no contemporary evidence to back it up. No newspaper accounts or legal documents or anything like that. All we have are stories, one of which was shared by Bat Masterson decades after Holliday's death. There was also a mention in one of Holliday's obituaries. Hell, even the Holliday family has stories, with some of them claiming that it's true and others saying that it was a pistol that Doc used, but that he purposely aimed high and the shot went over their heads without hurting anyone. So who knows, man? I think it's something that could have happened. It's certainly not outside the realm of possibility. But at this point, it does remain mostly uncorroborated. But yeah, it's thought by many that it was this shooting, or possibly even a combination of all the above, his tuberculosis and the unrequited love of a cousin, that caused Doc to head west. Per Holliday biographer Gary Roberts, quote, "Perhaps the truth was some combination of all these issues. Perhaps John Henry learned he had tuberculosis, pressed Maddie for an answer, only to be turned down, returned to Valdosta, and was forced west by the shooting incident. This much is clear. Something traumatic and devastating enough to interrupt his plans drove him west that summer of 1873. Coughing spasms, a broken heart, a shotgun blast, or combination of all three, cut him off forever from his past and threw him into an unknown future." End of quote. Well said, Mr. Roberts. Now, once Doc arrived in Dallas, he partnered up with fellow dentist John Seeger, or Segar. And by all accounts, they did prosper. Hell, they even won several prizes at the state fair, including Best Set of Teeth in Gold. Dude was just 22 years old and already an award-winning dentist. But the dark side soon came a-calling. You see, although nobody can say for certain when Holliday first started gambling, it was there in Dallas where the vice became an obsession. Or as Bat Masterson would later put it, In a short time, those who wished to consult professionally with a doctor had to do so over a card table in some nearby gambling establishment, or not at all. Hell, even Holliday himself would admit, quote, "I was a member of the Methodist Church and also a prominent member of the temperance organization until I deviated from the path of rectitude." I like how he puts that. Deviated from the path of rectitude. Sounds a lot like what happened to me when I turned 18. Only instead of gambling and shootouts, I just got really into big-bootied Latinas and cheap booze. But yeah, it was likely this deviation on Holliday's part that caused him and Doc Seeger to part ways in early March 1874. And then, just a month later, is when Holliday got arrested for playing Keno. Per historian Mark Lee Gardner, quote, "This arrest, the first on record for John Henry Holliday, marked the beginning of a restless life in one western town after another, consistently running afoul of the law, and more often than not, running afoul of other humans. Doc didn't completely give up dentistry, not right away, but gambling became his passion until eventually he did nothing else." End of quote. Later on that summer, Doc spent a brief period up in Denison before heading back to Dallas. And it's there in Dallas on New Year's Eve, 1874, that he experienced his very first known gunfight. Details are sparse, but story goes he exchanged bullets with a bartender known as Champagne Charlie. And although neither man sustained wounds, they were both arrested, with Holliday being charged with assault with the intent to murder. Luckily, he was acquitted less than a month later, at which point he headed some 200 miles west to Fort Griffin. Now, Fort Griffin back in those days was about as wild as you can imagine. Originally established in 1867 to protect settlers, the fort soon became a popular stopping point for cattle herds headed north. And in time, it would even serve as sort of a hub for bison hunters. According to Fort Griffin local Don Biggers, there were, quote, "buffalo hunters, bullwhackers, soldiers, cowpunchers, Indians, gamblers, toughs, refined businessmen, and fallen women, all mingling in one common herd on the streets. In front of every store or place of business, there was a long hitching rack, and these hitching racks were lined with horses. Thousands of buffalo hides were stacked here and there, and thousands more were loaded onto wagons ready to depart for Fort Worth. Everybody had plenty of money, and half a dozen big stores, 8 or 10 saloons, and 2 or 3 dance halls were doing business at full capacity. From more than a dozen places, music was being ground out on pianos, fiddles, banjos, and guitars. And the whole town was a babble of boisterous talk, whoops, curses, laughter, songs, and miserable music." End of quote. Now, as for Doc, he'd end up getting arrested there at Fort Griffin at least twice in the span of just 1 week. And rather than stick around and face the grand jury, he headed north for Denver. And those were gambling charges, by the way. Apparently, there was some weird law where you couldn't play cards in a saloon. Now, I wasn't able to find out much about Doc's time in Denver, at least not this go around, but he is alleged to have taken a knife to the neck of a fellow gambler. And I say alleged because, other than a few anecdotal stories, there's really no evidence to back it up. Sort of like that swimming hole incident back in Georgia. Doc may have also headed as far north as Cheyenne under the alias of Tom McKee. Once again, not really a lot in the way of evidence, but there was a guy named John C. Thomas who would later recall the following regarding Doc's time in Wyoming. Quote, "Run out of Texas because of his lethal propensities, this platinum blonde desperado tried Colorado, extinguished several gunmen there, came to Cheyenne, and did right well at gambling. The reputation of this dour misanthrope, with death gnawing on his lungs, caused him to be unchallenged here. Jeff Carr, the town marshal, regarded him dourly, but courageous though the big officer was, he didn't choose to take on a killer of Holliday's ruthless character." End of quote. And yeah, maybe, but then again, you gotta keep in mind that Doc still hadn't killed anyone yet by this point, at least not anyone that historians have been able to identify. I'm not saying that Holliday wasn't in Cheyenne. All I'm saying is we really don't know for sure one way or the other. We also don't know what he got up to for pretty much the entirety of 1876. According to some, Doc spent time in Deadwood and St. Louis. Others say he headed back to Texas, where he possibly killed a black soldier over at Jacksboro. And according to his family, Holliday paid a visit to one of his aunts up in Kansas. All we can know for certain is that he was definitely back in Dallas as early as January of 1877. And we know this because he was arrested yet again for gambling. And then 6 months later is when he got shot. Details are sparse. What else is new, right? But supposedly, during the summer of 1877, Holliday stepped inside a saloon over in the town of Breckenridge and delivered an ass whooping to the establishment's owner with a walking cane, an old boy by the name of Henry Kahn. Why? Nobody knows. Doc was arrested and he did pay a fine, but then just as soon as he was released, he headed straight back to the saloon, presumably to finish what he started. Only thing is, Mr. Kahn saw him coming, grabbed a pistol from a customer, and opened fire. We don't know exactly where the bullet struck Holliday or even how badly he was wounded, but it was apparently bad enough for some of the papers to report that he had died. But alas, he survived. And by the following September, he was back in Dallas, where he was once again arrested for gambling. That's also about the time he decided to try his luck back at Fort Griffin. I guess those past charges had already been dropped, and this time, Doc decided to stick around for a while. In fact, it was there at Fort Griffin that he either struck up or rekindled his relationship with Big Nose Kate. Now, if you'll remember earlier, I mentioned how Kate was in St. Louis in 1870, doing pretty much whatever she had to do to get by. She'd be arrested for prostitution in Wichita in 1874, and again in Dodge City the following summer for assault and battery. Of course, by that point, she was already going by the name of Kate Elder. That said, what she got up to between Dodge City and her rendezvous with Doc over in Fort Griffin, I'm not really sure if anyone knows. And speaking of knows, get it? We also don't know how she got the nickname Big Nose Kate. Seems like the answer would be pretty obvious, but then again, there are photos of Kate, and her nose really doesn't appear to be all that large. Hell, to be honest, she's actually not bad looking. A more plausible theory, I'm not really sure where this originates, but I've heard it many, many times. But a more plausible theory is that she got the name on account of always sticking her nose in other people's business. Either way, noses notwithstanding, she and Holliday certainly seemed to hit it off. According to her, Doc was a sharp dresser. He stood 6 feet tall, had fair complexion, blonde hair, blue eyes, a pretty mustache, and a fine set of teeth. She also claimed that he was a, quote, gentleman in manners to the ladies and to everyone. Being quiet, he never hunted for trouble, but if he was crowded, he knew how to take care of himself. Now, once again, this really comes down to who you want to believe. I mean, hell, Bat Masterson painted a completely different picture, saying that Holliday had a, quote, mean disposition and an ungovernable temper, and under the influence of liquor was a most dangerous man. He was hot-headed and impetuous, and very much given to both drinking and quarreling, and among men who did not fear him, he was very much disliked. End of quote, and damn, Bat, why don't you tell us how you really feel? I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Masterson probably wasn't all that big of a fan of Doc Holliday. Later on, he'd even claimed that Doc was a weakling who couldn't beat a healthy 15-year-old boy in a go-as-you-please fight. And the only reason he was ever nice to Holliday was on account of their shared friendship with Wyatt Earp. Speaking of Wyatt Earp, as fate would have it, it was right there at Fort Griffin where they first got acquainted. If you've ever seen the movie Wyatt Earp starring Kevin Costner, there's that scene where Doc and Wyatt meet over at Shancy's Saloon. And when Wyatt asked Holliday about the location of a wanted fugitive named Dave Rudaball, Doc responded by saying, Dave Rudaball is an ignorant scoundrel. I disapprove of his very existence. I considered ending it myself on several occasions, but self-control got the better of me. Besides, I'm a sporting man, not a killer. Now, I got no idea whether or not Doc said any of that, or whether he was constantly addressing Wyatt by his full name over and over again in a very annoying fashion, but the rest is pretty damn accurate. Earp really was on the trail of Rudaball, and when he stopped there at the saloon, the proprietor, John Chansey, really did introduce him to Holliday. Now, since we're on the topic of movies, there's another great scene, this one from Tombstone, where Doc got into it with a gambler named Ed Bailey. And that altercation also took place at Fort Griffin, allegedly. According to Wyatt Earp in a 1906 interview, quote, Doc Holliday was spending the evening in a poker game, which was his custom whenever a faro bank did not present superior claims on his attention. On his right sat Ed Bailey, who needs no description because he is soon to drop out of this narrative. The trouble began, as it was related to me afterward, by Ed Bailey monkeying with the dead wood, or what people who live in cities call discards. Doc Holliday admonished him once or twice to play poker, which is your seasoned gambler's method of cautioning a friend to stop cheating. But the misguided Bailey persisted in his furtive attentions to the dead wood. Finally, having detected him again, Holliday pulled down a pot without showing his hand, which he had perfect right to do. Thereupon Bailey started throwing his gun around on Holliday, as might have been expected. But before he could pull the trigger, Doc Holliday jerked a knife and caught Bailey just below the brisket. End of quote. That knife, by the way, was called the Hell Bitch. I'm not making this up. It was actually a gift from a family member back in Georgia. And I don't know for certain that this is the knife that he used on Bailey, but he definitely had a hog sticker called the Hell Bitch. And I, for one, find that awesome. Now, in the movie Tombstone, we see Doc and Kate just sort of hastily making their retreat immediately following the stabbing. In real life, however, Doc was placed under guard by two lawmen in a nearby hotel. Kate, fearing that Doc would be lynched by some of Bailey's friends, then snuck around to the back and set a shed on fire. As soon as everyone was distracted, she busted in with two revolvers, tossing one to Holliday and keeping the other pointed straight at the deputies. They then slowly backed out of the room, hopped on a horse, and hauled ass. Maybe. To quote historian Mark Lee Gardner, Doc and Kate's Fort Griffin escapade is one hell of a story, and it may even be true. In all reality, there are no records of Holliday stabbing anyone at Fort Griffin. According to Big Nose Kate, never even happened. And the only source we have on this, Wyatt Earp, never even claimed to have witnessed it firsthand. Per biographer Gary Roberts, quote, "Given Holliday's peregrinations," how's that for a $5 word, "and Earp's known movements, the Bailey episode could have happened somewhere other than Fort Griffin, someplace like Brackett or Santa Angela, whose records are scarce or non-existent, and whose townships had no newspapers. Much that happened in those camps off the beaten path escaped attention. At any rate, that spring, Doc and Kate headed north to Sweetwater, and from there took the wagon road to Dodge City. Wyatt Earp returned to Dodge in May, and he later said that Doc had already arrived and had settled in by the time he got back. This time, Doc Holliday had left Texas for good. Back in 1878, Dodge City was a veritable who's who of the Wild West. Not only did you have Bat Masterson as the county sheriff, along with the legendary Charlie Bassett as the town marshal, but you also had a young lawman by the name of Wyatt Earp serving as Bassett's second in command. Not to mention other notable characters like Bill Tillman, J.J. Webb, Mysterious Dave Mather, and even a dentist/gambler known as Doc Holliday. In fact, it's there in Dodge, either during the spring or summer of 1878, where Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday formed a friendship that would last a lifetime. Story goes that Earp found himself surrounded one evening by a gang of desperados. Outnumbered and with no way out, Wyatt had no choice but to stand his ground come what may. And then, just as things seemed dire, here comes Holliday, running out of saloon, pistols in each hand, and holding the ne'er-do-wells at bay as Wyatt placed him under arrest. Now, even though Doc and Wyatt had first become acquainted down in Texas months prior, according to Earp, it was, quote, "because of this episode that I became the friend of Doc Holliday ever after," end of quote. There are additional stories regarding Holliday's time there in Dodge, claiming that he was everything from a dangerous drunk to a con artist. But so far as the official records are concerned, it does appear as if he kept a relatively low profile. This was even confirmed by Bat Masterson later on, when he wrote that Holliday stayed out of trouble the entire time he was in Dodge. That said, he did place an ad in the Dodge City Times advertising his services as a dentist. How much dentistry he actually accomplished is unknown, given all of his drinking and gambling, but he was said to have carried what was described as a pocket dental office. Just sort of a small kit of basic tools that he hauled around in a case. Kinda makes me wonder if the stories are true about him yanking teeth while playing poker. But what did Doc Holliday get up to after Dodge City? How'd he and Earp wind up together in Tombstone taking on the Cochise County Cowboys? And just how big was his girlfriend's nose anyway? Join me today as we discuss all of that and more, including Holliday's time in Vegas. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Yeehaw! Now, eventually, Doc and his gal pal, Kate Elder, would follow the railroad west to Trinidad, Colorado, a town that a journalist once described as having all of the, quote, "numerous necessary evils you always find in a live, wide-awake, get-up town." In other words, there were plenty of saloons and gambling joints for Doc to ply his trade. By the way, this is part 2 in an ongoing series on Doc Holliday. If you'd like to check out part 1, I do have a link down below. We discuss everything from Doc's early childhood, his romance with his cousin, and even his first gunfight down in Texas. Pretty much everything up until he arrived in Dodge City during the spring or early summer of 1878. Now, like I said, Holliday and Kate would head west to Trinidad later on that fall, but they would not remain long. Possibly on account of Doc shooting a man known as Kid Colton or Kid Dalton. Not a lot of details on this. If I'm not mistaken, the only sources are Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson, neither of whom could agree on the guy's name. But according to Masterson, Doc shot him over a, quote, very trivial matter. After which he and Kate moved on yet again, this time about 130 miles south to Las Vegas, New Mexico. Or to be more precise, the Montezuma Hot Springs, just north of Las Vegas. Remember, there wasn't a cure for tuberculosis back in those days, and Doc certainly wasn't getting no better. In fact, by the time they left Trinidad, he was in pretty rough shape, hence the hot springs. The hot springs, of course, were thought to have curative effects on various ailments, including tuberculosis. Hell, this one in particular, north of Vegas, even had something known as the Lungers Club. Not only that, but they even had a motto. Cure our maladies, we tuberculars unite. Coughing and wheezing, we continue the fight. For rest and recuperations, in hot springs we soak. For if we can't fuck our cousins, then we might as well croak. Okay, so I did make up that last part, but the rest is true. There really was a Lungers Club in Vegas, and that really was their motto, minus the part about screwing their cousins. Sorry, I couldn't resist. A little throwback to earlier in the series when we discussed Doc's relationship with his cousin Maddie. But yeah, in all seriousness, these hot springs really didn't offer up much of a remedy for tuberculosis. Obviously, right? I mean, there was nothing magical about the water. That said, all the heat and rest and dry air did get Doc feeling a little better. And once he was able, he and Kate moved into Las Vegas proper. It's there where Holliday would once again open up a dental practice, as well as resume the life of a gambler. Only problem was the damn territorial government had recently issued a law prohibiting gambling, and that being the case, Doc would be arrested a total of 3 times over the next 6 months, twice for gambling and once for carrying a pistol. Now, one of the things that you'll often hear about Holliday is that he left Vegas either during the spring or summer of 1879 in order to help out Bat Masterson recruit some gunfighters for Colorado's Royal Gorge War. This is a conflict we've discussed previously here on the show, and I will be returning to it in the future when I cover Masterson. But long story short, there's really no evidence whatsoever that Holliday was involved. Masterson himself never even once mentioned Doc helping to recruit the fighters, and the only source that I'm aware of for Holliday's participation comes from vaudeville actor Eddie Foy. He wrote about it in his 1928 autobiography and claimed that Doc tried to recruit him, but then again, Foy was known to stretch the truth. In all reality, it looks as if Doc remained there in the vicinity of Las Vegas. I know at one point he traveled north to Otero, which, if I'm not mistaken, is now the town of Raton, New Mexico, and it's there where he was alleged to have killed a man, but once again, there's nothing in the way of evidence proving as much. According to historian Mark Lee Gardner, quote, while in Otero, Doc may or may not have killed a man in self-defense. Probably not. End of quote. Now, on July 19th, 1879, Doc would open up his very own saloon in Las Vegas, New Mexico, which coincidentally is also the same day that he killed a ne'er-do-well by the name of Mike Gordon. Apparently, Gordon had been getting his drink on over in Doc's joint during the grand opening and tried talking one of the sporting gals into leaving with him. And when she refused, Gordon stepped outside, pulled out his gun, and started firing directly into the saloon. What happened next is a bit chaotic, and details do differ, depending on your sources, but we do know that Holliday managed to step outside and put a bullet straight into Gordon's chest. There was a coroner's inquest, but I guess Gordon wasn't all that well liked, and nobody was willing to identify Doc as the shooter, so he got off scot-free. Now, remember earlier when I said that Dodge City was sort of a who's who when it came to the Old West? Well, the same thing also applies to Las Vegas, New Mexico. Not only did you have a lot of the same guys who had been in Dodge, like J.J. Webb, Rudaball, and Dave Mather, but you also had Hoodoo Brown, Clay Allison. Eventually, Billy the Kid would start hanging out there. Hell, even Jesse James was rumored to have visited Vegas. And at some point in late fall or early winter of 1879, So did Wyatt Earp. Just not for very long. You see, Wyatt had resigned his position in Dodge City the previous September and was looking to try his luck down in the new boomtown of Tombstone. According to historian Mark Lee Gardner, quote, "At Las Vegas came the cheerful reunion between Wyatt and Doc. Kate Elder, though, found nothing cheerful about it. She was jealous of anything or anyone she saw as competition for Doc's attentions. She went into a rage when she once found another woman with Doc. Brandishing a big knife, Kate threatened to rip her open. Doc's gal never threatened Wyatt, but she didn't like him, and she especially didn't like the strong influence he held over her lover. And Kate blamed Wyatt for all the subsequent trouble she had with Doc. I loved Doc and thought the world of him," she said decades later, "and he was always kind to me until he got mixed up with the Earps. This reunion," she said, "meant the end of the happiness we had enjoyed." End of quote. And yeah, apparently Wyatt really did have somewhat of a strong influence on Holliday, as he soon convinced him to tag along to Arizona. And Kate, her hatred of Wyatt notwithstanding, decided to join him. The group ended up stopping over at Prescott, where Wyatt's brother Virgil was living, but apparently old Doc didn't give much of a first impression to Virgil's wife. She would later recall, quote, "Wyatt kind of casually introduced him to us as a dentist. Right away, I said, 'How'd you like to yank out a loose tooth of mine?' He gave me a nasty look and said, 'Keep your baby teeth in your mouth where they belong. I've got no use for 'em.' Wyatt roared like it was a big joke." End of quote. I like that. Now, Wyatt and Virgil would pull out for Tombstone just a few weeks later, but Doc and Kate chose to remain behind in Prescott, most likely at Kate's urgings. But then again, the area was ripe for the picking. In fact, there was even a part of town known as Whiskey Row. It catered not only to prospectors, but also soldiers from nearby Fort Whipple. For a seasoned gambler like Holliday, it must have been like shooting fish in a barrel. That said, he would end up heading back to Vegas in late February of 1880 to get one of his old gambling charges dismissed. And since he was already in town, he decided to go ahead and kill a man by the name of Charles Wright. Now, bear with me for a moment, as this does get a little confusing, but supposedly Doc and Wright had known one another back in Dodge City, where, per Holliday biographer Gary Roberts, Wright had a shady reputation. Mr. Roberts also alleges that Wright was related to Dodge City businessman Robert M. Wright, same old boy who would try to get Clay Allison to kill Wyatt Earp. And when money came up missing from Robert's store, Charlie falsely accused Doc of being the culprit. I'm not really sure how much evidence we have to support any of these claims, but if that's true, it could at least somewhat explain Holliday's actions there in Vegas. I guess Doc heard that Wright was in town working as a bartender, so he made it a point to look him up. And per an eyewitness, quote, "Doc entered the saloon with a cocked revolver in his hand and began hostilities at once, without previously making his presence known. Wright was in the act of serving some thirsty customers, but recognizing his old enemy from Dodge City, he ducked behind the bar just in time, while the customers ducked to the floor. Wright quickly emerged with a six-shooter and a duel began in dead earnest, many shots being exchanged at short distance without effect." End of quote. Now, eventually one of Doc's bullets would hit pay dirt, and Wright dropped to the floor in what historian Mark Lee Gardner described as a lifeless heap. Meanwhile, Holliday just casually stepped outside and went about his business. Turns out Wright wasn't dead, though. Doc's bullet had merely grazed the skin near his spine, causing a temporary case of paralysis. And by later on that day, he was back on his feet tin and bar. By the way, this is just a fun little side note, but Charlie Wright had also, allegedly, seen action during the Second Battle of Adobe Walls. In fact, the guy I mentioned a moment ago, Robert Wright, was part owner of Rath's store, where several of the defenders were holed up. Skip ahead to Fort Worth in 1890, and Wright narrowly avoided death yet again when he got into a gunfight with Luke Short. And although both men were wounded, they would survive. Which is crazy to think about. Not only did Charlie Wright survive the Kiowa and Comanche, but he also survived gunfights with two of the deadliest gunslingers of the Old West. Not only that, but he outlived both of them, dying of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in 1907. Now, this all comes with a very, very big asterisk. I feel like it's my duty to point out that much of what you just heard is pure speculation. We don't know for sure that the Las Vegas Charlie was the same Charlie who shot Luke Short. We also don't know for certain whether he was related to Robert Wright or even if the Charlie who died in 1907 was the same guy who fought at Adobe Walls. And since we're splitting hairs, we also don't know for certain that Doc Holliday tried to kill him. You see that whole story about Doc going into the saloon, guns ablazing and shooting right? That comes from just one source, a book titled My Life on the Frontier by Miguel Otero, which was published over a half a century after the fact. And I hate to sound like that guy, the well, actually kind of guy, but this is a big theme throughout Holliday's story. There's just so many legends and tall tales surrounding this guy, but when you really get down to it, many of his alleged exploits are completely lacking when it comes to credible sources. He may have shot right, exactly as Otero claimed, but then again, it's also possible that Otero just fabricated the entire incident. As of this recording, we really don't have enough evidence. Either way, Doc would head back to Prescott shortly thereafter and have his likeness taken by photographer Daniel Mitchell. Now, by the way, speaking of photographs, believe it or not, there are only 2 images of Holliday as an adult that are provably authentic. There's the one from when he graduated dental school, and then there's this most recent photo that was taken at Prescott. All the others that you see online are either of unknown provenance or just verified fakes. I actually have an entire video about this on YouTube if you'd like to learn more. I think it's titled This Is Not Doc Holliday, but the one taken there in Prescott is definitely the real deal. And yeah, by mid-September of 1880 is when Doc finally made the move to Tombstone. Turns out things had changed quite a bit since he and Wyatt had last seen one another. You see, Wyatt and his brother Virgil had initially planned on starting their own stagecoach business. Only problem is there was already a couple of stage companies there in Tombstone, so Wyatt instead took a job riding shotgun for Wells Fargo, as Virgil settled in as a deputy U.S. Marshal. In fact, it was Virgil's capacity as Marshal that saw the first clash between the Earps and the Cowboys. Apparently, he had led a posse, including brothers Wyatt and Morgan, after some stolen army mules which they found in the possession of the McLaury brothers, Tom and Frank. Now, in time, this feud between them and the Cowboys would greatly intensify. And don't worry, we'll get to that here shortly. But it's worth noting that Wyatt Earp was not yet an official lawman, at least not when he had that run-in with the McLaurys. He was just working for Wells Fargo, doing a little bit of speculation and a whole hell of a lot of gambling. That said, by the time Doc arrived, Wyatt had already accepted a position as deputy sheriff for Pima County. Speaking of Doc, he wasn't even in Tombstone for a full month before he got arrested. He and another gambler by the name of Johnny Tyler, that's right, the madcap Johnny Tyler, began quarreling at the Oriental Saloon on the night of October 10th. Things escalated quickly, and just as Doc and Tyler were about to go for their guns, a crowd rushed in to separate them. Pistols were confiscated, and the saloon's manager, a guy by the name of Milt Joyce, ordered Tyler to get the hell out. Joyce then turned his ire on Doc and started berating him for causing trouble. I guess Holliday didn't like such loose talk, so he started giving it right back. Or at least he did until Joyce, a former blacksmith, went ahead and physically threw Doc out the front door. He returned just moments later, demanding his gun, but Joyce told him to kick rocks. Probably not the smartest of choices, as Doc did show back up later on that night with a borrowed pistol, which he used to shoot Joyce in the hand. This is actually very similar to that story of him shooting Charlie Wright. In both accounts, Doc simply stepped inside and commenced a shooting. He would actually fire a total of 3 shots before Joyce managed to rush in and disarm him. Per historian Mark Lee Gardner, quote, Virgil Earp arrested Doc and escorted him from the saloon. When Doc was finally able to appear before the Justice of the Peace, 4 witnesses curiously failed to appear. A charge of attempted murder was dropped, and Doc pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of assault and battery. He got off with a fine plus court costs. Milt Joyce, however, came very close to losing his hand. The gunshot wound eventually healed, but the scar was a bitter reminder that Doc Holliday had tried to kill him. And the fact that Holliday and the Earps were tight didn't make Joyce think too kindly of the Earps either. End of quote. So there you have it. Once again, Doc not exactly making a great first impression. Now, just a couple weeks later is when cowboy leader Curly Bill Brocious shot and killed Tombstone Marshal Fred White. And by the way, if it seems like I'm sort of glossing over certain events from Tombstone, don't worry, because we will be starting a series on Wyatt Earp very soon. at which time I will go way more in depth. Long story short, though, there was a group of rustlers there in Pima County known as the Cowboys. I spoke about these guys recently in the Old Man Clanton episode, but they were essentially just a loose confederation of ranchers and, in many cases, outright bandits who routinely joined forces to steal cattle and rob stagecoaches. Not only did they have a ready market for stolen beef there in Tombstone with all the hungry prospectors, but they also sold cattle to the reservation over at San Carlos. Curly Bill Brocious was one of the leaders, but you also had the McLaury brothers, you had the notorious Johnny Ringo, Pony Dill, Billy the Kid Claiborne, Frank Stillwell, Sherman McMaster, Michael Rourke, also known as Johnny Behind the Deuce, and of course the infamous Clanton brothers, Ike, Phineas, and Billy. Estimates vary as to their numbers, but according to Virgil Earp, there were around 200 of them. And believe it or not, as violent as the Cowboys were, they were not universally hated. In fact, they even had quite a few allies there in Tombstone. Once again, according to Wyatt's brother Virgil, the Cowboys spent money, quote, free as water in the saloons, dance houses, or faro banks. And this is one reason why they have so many friends in town. All that large class of degraded characters who gather the crumbs of such carouses stand ready to assist them out of any trouble or into any pain, rascality. The saloons and gambling houses, into whose treasuries most of the money is ultimately turned, receive them cordially and must be called warm friends of the Cowboys. A good many of the merchants fear to express themselves against the criminal element because they want to keep the patronage of the Cowboys' friends. And the result is that when any conflict between officers and cattle thieves or stage robbers occurs, followed by shootings around town, most of the expression of opinion comes from the desperado class and their friends. And the men who should speak the loudest and the most decisively to correct the condition of affairs are generally the quietest. End of quote. And yeah, turns out it wasn't just the saloon owners who were being all buddy-buddy with the Cowboys. Apparently, a few of the local politicians also realized they constituted a large voting bloc and likewise solicited their approval. Hell, when Pima County Sheriff Charles Scheibel run for re-election in November of 1880, it was the Cowboys who helped him win by stuffing the ballots. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to sort of set the scene real quick and give you a bit of a backstory on these various players there in Tombstone. Suffice it to say, there was a lot going on. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, it was on October 28th, 1880, when Curly Bill Brocious shot Marshall White. And contrary to what you may have seen in some of the movies, this was an accidental killing. They were even able to prove in court later on that the revolver had a malfunction, allowing it to fire on half-cock. It's also worth noting that Marshall White was only like 30 or 31 years old at the time of his death, as opposed to actor Harry Carey Jr., who was in his 70s when he portrayed White in the movie Tombstone. But yeah, like I said, this was an accident, and despite Brocious otherwise being a complete asshole, charges were eventually dropped. Now, Wyatt Earp would eventually quit his job as deputy sheriff out of protest following that rigged election of Sheriff Scheibel, or however the hell you pronounce this guy's name. Wyatt then thought about running for sheriff of the newly formed Cochise County, where Tombstone was, but rather than risk losing to his rival, Johnny Behan, the pair instead made a deal. If Wyatt would drop out of the race, Behan would appoint him as under-sheriff. And then just to sweeten the pot, Behan agreed to split the tax revenue. You see, back in those days, one of the main responsibilities as a sheriff was to collect taxes. And in a lot of places, the sheriff was able to keep a portion of the revenue. This is what they used to pay their deputies and various other expenses. Just to give you an idea, in the year 1882, the sheriff's office there in Cochise County collected over $24,000 in taxes. I guess Wyatt felt like it would be a pretty lucrative deal, so he agreed. The only thing is, when Behan received the appointment, he completely reneged on the offer. And then when Wyatt and Virgil helped apprehend a stagecoach robber, Behan refused to reimburse him on account of not officially swearing him in as deputies. So needless to say, there was no love lost there in Tombstone between the Earps and the Cowboys and Sheriff Behan. Not to mention guys like Milt Joyce. As for Doc Holliday, he too was staying busy. He dabbled in a few mining properties as well as water rights, and even ran a faro bank over at the Alhambra Saloon. He also reunited with his lady love, Big Nose Kate. In fact, it was likely an argument with Kate that caused him to get arrested yet again on March 10th, 1881. Per the Daily Epitaph, quote, "Noted gambler Doc Holliday had a row with his paramour, Kate Elder, yesterday of an evening. The pair had been quarreling over someone whom Kate referred to as that whore cousin of yours. Mr. Holliday responded by saying, 'Don't you ever talk about my sweet Mattie like that ever again, or you're going to get it. Sure, she's my cousin, and yes, I'm aware of how weird that is, but hey, that ass just won't quit. And besides, when you turn the lights off, you can barely even tell that we're related.'" End of quote. And no, I did just make that up. As far as I'm aware, this fight had absolutely nothing to do with Doc's cousin Mattie, who we will be discussing more of later. In all reality, the Daily Epitaph reported the following, quote, "A man about town named John Doc, last night, while under the influence of too much family disturber, grew noisy and disorderly, and officers Ramsey and Kirkpatrick proceeded forthwith to take him in. While that transaction was in progress, the inevitable gun made its appearance, and in the melee was somehow discharged, the shot fortunately striking no one. The shootist was taken before Judge Wallace, and when that official got through with Doc, the latter was $25 poorer." End of quote. So yeah, apparently Holliday had gotten his load on and started fighting with Kate. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but she had initially chosen not to come with him to Tombstone. And when she finally showed up, she was still jealous over his relationship with Wyatt Earp. Which, in all fairness, this was not just a woman's intuition. By all accounts, Holliday really was fully devoted to Wyatt. Bat Masterson would even describe Doc as having his whole heart and soul wrapped up in Wyatt Earp, and that he was always ready to stake his life in defense of any cause in which Wyatt was interested. And according to Virgil Earp, quote, "Outside of us boys, I don't think he had a friend in the territory. He was a slender, sickly feller, but whenever a stage was robbed or a row started and help was needed, Doc was one of the first to saddle his horse and report for duty." You know, I'm probably not alone in this, but one of my favorite quotes from Tombstone is when Turkey Creek Jack Johnson asked Doc, "Why do you do it?" In other words, why are you getting yourself involved in all this, riding around and getting shot at when you're clearly suffering from tuberculosis? Why not just stay in bed and relax? And what does Holliday say in response? "Because Wyatt Earp is my friend." Prompting Johnson to state, "Well, hell, I got lots of friends." To which Doc replied, "I don't." And yes, I do know that's just a Hollywood script, but it's still a very powerful statement, especially for a man like Doc Holliday who didn't necessarily fit in with the rest of society. If you're a guy like Doc and you find that one friend, the one who accepts you for who and what you are, warts and all, well, that's someone you'll die for. And I reckon Holliday felt that way about Wyatt Earp. That said, there was another guy there in Tombstone who Doc was friends with, a dope fiend and fellow lunger by the name of Bill Leonard. And that's what we'll be discussing next week, as well as Leonard's role in the Benson stage robbery, which, as fate would have it, would eventually lead to the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral, which we will also be discussing in full. The gunfight at the OK Corral is arguably the most famous shootout in all of American history. On one side, you had Wyatt Earp, his brothers Morgan and Virgil, and Doc Holliday. And on the other, you had the Clantons, the McLaury brothers, and Billy Claiborne. The entire fight lasted just 30 seconds. There was an estimated 30 shots fired at an extremely close range, and once the smoke cleared, 3 men were dead. But what exactly caused things to erupt in such a violent manner? Well, I think most people would just chalk it up to a simple case of good guys versus bad guys. I mean, after all, the Clantons were aligned with the Cowboys, a loose gang of killers, thieves, and smugglers. And the Earps, of course, represented law and order, at least outwardly. So yeah, to most casual observers, the shootout was just the inevitable collision between outlaws and lawmen. But what I think a lot of people don't realize, what's not even mentioned in movies like Tombstone, is that the Earp-Clanton feud originated with a botched robbery some 7 months prior. You see, on March 15th, 1881, there was an attempted stage holdup between the towns of Tombstone and Benson. And thankfully, despite the driver and a passenger being killed, the guy riding shotgun did manage to fend off the bandits long enough to get everyone else to safety. Posse was formed the following day, and they were able to arrest one of the suspects, an old boy by the name of Luther King. And in turn, Luther squealed on his accomplices, fellow Cochise County Cowboys Jim Crane, Harry Head, and Billy Leonard. Now, it just so happened that Leonard was good friends with none other than Doc Holliday. In fact, Doc had even paid Leonard a visit on the very same day as the holdup. and it was this association that led some to think that Doc was in on it. Rumors began to swirl, and it wasn't long before Holliday found himself under arrest for making quote-unquote threats against life. Apparently, his old enemy, Milt Joyce, accused him of being a stage robber, and rather than let the insult slide, Doc went for his gun. Luckily, Sheriff Behan was present and able to intervene before shots were fired, but nonetheless, Holliday was taken into custody, and the rumors persisted. So much so that Wyatt Earp would eventually hatch a plan, not only to clear Doc's name, but to hopefully gain a little glory in the process. You see, Wyatt had accurately concluded that many of the Cochise County Cowboys would sell out their own mothers just to earn a quick buck. And considering that the Benson stage suspects had a substantial amount of money on their heads, I guess Wyatt figured he could use this lack of honor to his advantage. So he reached out to Cowboys Ike Clanton, Joe Hill, and Frank McLaury, saying that if they'd provide the location of the suspects, he'd see to it that they got the full bounty. He'd also keep his mouth shut as to where he got the information. And they agreed. Only thing is, Doc's buddy Leonard and another suspect, Harry Head, were both killed over in Eureka before the plan came to fruition. As for the third suspect, Jimmy Crane, he'd be shot dead a month later by Mexican soldados. This is the same ambush I discussed in a previous episode that saw the death of Old Man Clanton. Now, these setbacks aside, as far as I'm aware, Wyatt never did spill the beans in regard to that agreement with Ike. But much to Ike's dismay, Wells Fargo agent Marshall Williams was able to put two and two together. Per historian Mark Lee Gardner, quote, Marshall witnessed Wyatt and Ike together a number of times in close conversation. Seeing these two together just once would have been odd, and Williams rightfully guessed they were plotting to nab the stage robbers. Unfortunately, an intoxicated William approached Ike sometime later and began mumbling about the reward and Ike aiding Wyatt. Ike couldn't help but conclude that their secret was out. End of quote. Now, this next part probably goes without saying, but Ike Clanton was not a happy camper, which I do think is understandable. I mean, if his fellow cowboys knew he was working with the authorities, there would be absolute hell to pay. So, that being the case, he went ahead and confronted Wyatt. And even though Wyatt denied saying anything to Williams, Clanton and the McLaurys began levying threats, not only against Wyatt, but also his brothers, and even our very own Doc Holliday. Now, as far as Doc's involvement in the Benson stage robbery, rumors notwithstanding, I do think it's unlikely. And for what it's worth, so did Wyatt Earp. He'd stated as much years later when he wrote that Doc was not in the Benson stage holdup, and that he never did such a thing as holdups in his life. Be that as it may, Holliday found himself under arrest yet again on July 5th, after getting into a fight with his gal pal, Big Nose Kate. I don't know exactly what he did to piss her off, but it was enough to make her go tell Sheriff Behan that Doc had indeed been part of the Benson holdup. This was a total lie on Kate's part. She'd even admit to it later on. But nevertheless, Holliday was once again taken into custody. I guess Kate was on one hell of a bender as she too was arrested for being drunk and disorderly. Now, luckily for Doc, he was able to post bail and appear before Judge Spicer on the morning of July 9th, at which point the case was dismissed due to a complete lack of evidence. And believe it or not, he and Kate would actually make amends. Hell, they even went on vacation together over in Tucson. And while they were gone is when Ike Clanton started telling lies about him. Remember, Ike was a nervous wreck over that deal he had made with Wyatt Earp to betray his friends. And even though a full 5 months had already passed, he was still terrified that his fellow cowboys would learn the truth. So he once again confronted Wyatt, only this time accusing him of telling Holliday about their agreement. Earp once again denied the allegations, but Ike claimed that it was Doc who had told him. Now, I don't know whether or not Clanton was telling the truth or just fishing for information. I think it was most likely the latter. But either way, Doc did not appreciate having his name involved. In fact, just as soon as he got back to town in late October, he found Ike and called him a lying son of a bitch straight to his face, among other things. According to a bystander, Doc's vocabulary of profanity was monumental, and he worked it proficiently in talking to Ike. Not only that, but Doc had also stuck his hand in his pocket, presumably around the butt of a pistol, telling Clanton to do the same. But as fate would have it, Ike was unarmed. Now, eventually they were separated, and Doc went back to his room to sleep it off. Ike, on the other hand, continued drinking. He also found himself a pistol and started gallivanting around town making threats, both against Doc Holliday and the Earp brothers. And come daylight, he was still drunk, just prancing around with his pistol on his belt and Winchester in hand, telling all who'd listen that he was out for blood. Hell, he even went to Doc's boarding house, but Holliday was still fast asleep. Wasn't until he woke up that Kate told him that I could come calling, to which Doc responded, "If God lets me live long enough to get my clothes on, he shall see me." Now by noon, the Earp boys had also been roused from bed, and after hearing about Ike's continued threats, along with the fact that he was brandishing firearms within city limits, they set out at once to arrest him. According to Virgil, quote, "I found Ike Clanton on 4th Street between Fremont and Allen with a Winchester in his hand and a 6-shooter stuck down in his breeches. I walked up and grabbed the rifle in my left hand. He let loose and started to draw his 6-shooter. I hit him over the head with mine and knocked him to his knees and took his 6-shooter from him. I asked him if he was hunting for me. He said he was, and if he had seen me a second sooner, he would have killed me. I arrested Ike for carrying firearms inside the city limits." End of quote. By the way, I may have failed to mention this, but by the fall of 1881, Virgil was the official Marshal of Tombstone. His brother Morgan was one of his deputies, and if I'm not mistaken, Wyatt was holding a commission as a deputy U.S. Marshal, in addition to being sworn in as a special policeman. And if you know anything about Tombstone history, you probably know what's coming next, right? The famous gunfight at the OK Corral. Like I mentioned earlier in the series, I do plan on going way more in depth on all of this when we cover Wyatt Earp, so my apologies if I'm sort of glossing over a few things. But long story short, Ike would not remain in custody for long. All he had to do was pay a fine, and then he was let loose. Meanwhile, Wyatt was having his own little confrontation with Ike's buddy, Tom McLaury. I guess Tom was making the same sort of threats as Ike, so Wyatt slapped him across the face, gave him a few whacks upside the head with his pistol for good measure. It's also about when Tom's brother Frank came riding into town with Billy Clanton. They all linked up with Ike over at the gun store and then started making their way down to the Dexter stables, with Wyatt close on their heels. Now, at some point during all this, Virgil met up with Cochise County Sheriff Johnny Behan, basically just to discuss the situation. It's a little unclear as to what exactly was said. Both of them would later give conflicting stories, but Behan did agree to go speak with Ike and his compadres and hopefully disarm them. And by the time Behan caught up with them, they were already at the OK Corral, where a bystander named Sills heard him making additional threats, saying that they were going to kill the Earps on sight. Sills then ran and told Virgil, and this was pretty much the straw that broke the camel's back. Not only were the cowboys breaking the law by carrying firearms, but I also think the Earps were just flat out tired of all the constant threats. There's a lot more involved, obviously, but today we're talking about Doc Holliday, so that's who I'm mostly focusing on. Speaking of Doc, he had just finished a leisurely breakfast and joined the Earps over by Hafford's Saloon, wearing a fancy overcoat and carrying a silver-headed cane. And when the Earp boys headed off to arrest Ike and the McLaurys, Doc spoke up and asked if they were planning on leaving him behind. Wyatt Earp warned him that this was likely to be a hard game, and Doc replied with a smile, saying, "That's just the kind I like." Maybe. Per usual, there are a few different stories. Another version has Wyatt telling Doc that he didn't need to trouble himself, and Holliday replying with, "That's a hell of a thing for you to say to me." Either way, the point still stands, right? Doc made it abundantly clear that he wasn't just going to wait on the sidelines as Wyatt and his brothers marched off to battle. So, that being the case, Virgil just went ahead and gave Doc his shotgun so he could hide it under his coat. In turn, Doc gave his walking stick to Virgil, and on they marched. Meanwhile, the cowboys, whose numbers now included 21-year-old Billy Claiborne, had made their way to a vacant lot next to Fly's photo shop. I know I said earlier they had all been at the OK Corral, which they had been, but believe it or not, the actual gunfight would not take place at the OK Corral. In all reality, it occurred at that vacant lot I mentioned a second ago. Still very close to the corral, but not the actual corral. I also said that Sheriff Behan had gone to speak with the cowboys, which was also true, but unfortunately he was not successful in taking their guns. Now there is some debate as to whether or not Behan then lied and told the Earps that the cowboys were unarmed. We'll go ahead and cover that at a later date when I do the whole Wyatt Earp series. But yes, by the time Doc and the others arrived, the cowboys were still brandishing firearms, at least most of them. According to historian Casey Teffer-Tiller, quote, "Much to the Earp's surprise, the cowboys had not been disarmed. According to Virgil Earp, Billy Clanton and Frank McLaury had their hands on their 6-shooters, while Tom McLaury reached for a rifle and a scabbard on his horse's saddle." End of quote. And yeah, once Holliday and the Earps turned the corner on Fremont Street and the cowboys came into view, that's when Doc went ahead and thumbed back the hammers on that scatter gun. Wyatt likewise drew and cocked his revolver. Finally, when there was just a few feet separating both groups, Virgil told the cowboys to throw their hands up. No sooner had the words left his mouth when Billy Clanton and Frank McLaury went for their guns, causing Virgil to shout, "Hold, I don't want that." Sadly, however, it was just far too late. Wyatt raised a pistol of his own as he and Billy shot at the exact same moment. Billy's shot went wild, but Wyatt struck Frank McLaury in the belly. Per historian Mark Lee Gardner, quote, "These first two shots were followed by the slightest of pauses, as if everyone needed a split second to process that this was really happening, that they were in a fight to the death." Virgil quickly switched the cane to his left hand and jerked out his revolver with his right. Then came more metallic clicks, flames streaking from barrel muzzles, and the sound of gunshots reverberating off the walls of the buildings on each side. End of quote. Now you may find this next part hard to believe, but the tough-talking Ike Clanton then ran up to Wyatt, grabbed him by the arm, and begged him not to kill him, to which Wyatt responded by shoving Ike aside and telling him to either get to fighting or to get away. Ike did as he was told and sought refuge in a nearby building. Likewise for Billy Claiborne. That left just the already wounded Frank McLaury, his brother Tom, and Billy Clanton to face off against the Earps and Holliday. Tom managed to put a bullet in Morgan's shoulder, but Wyatt was able to shoot the horse that Tom was hiding behind. And then when the horse jumped is when Doc unloaded one of the barrels of his shotgun into Tom's right side. Holliday tried squeezing the other trigger as well, but it refused to fire, so he tossed it aside and yanked out his pistol. Of course, by that point, Tom had already collapsed in the street. Meanwhile, the wounded Frank McLaury shot Virgil in his right calf and put another round through Wyatt's coat. He then spotted Doc and hollered, "I've got you now," to which Doc allegedly responded, "Blaze away, you're a daisy if you do." Both men then fired, with Frank's round grazing Doc's thigh, and Holliday striking Frank squarely in the chest. At that very same moment, the wounded Morgan had managed to struggle to his knees and sent a bullet into Frank's head, at which point it was pretty much over. Fight was done in less time than it took to tell it. Billy Clanton and the McLaury brothers were dead. Virgil and Morgan were wounded, Doc had a bruised leg, and Wyatt was left unscathed. As for Holliday, he went back to his hotel room and wept. According to Kate Elder, quote, "After the fight, Doc came in, sat down on the side of the bed, and cried and said, 'Oh, this is awful, awful.' I asked, 'Are you hurt?' He said, 'No, I am not.' He pulled up his shirt. There was just a pale red streak about 2 inches long across his hip where the bullet had grazed him." End of quote. Now, I know previously I mentioned that I don't really consider Kate to be all that credible of a source, but if this really happened the way she claimed, I do find it to be very interesting. I've got no first-hand experience, but they say the shock of a firefight doesn't really set in until afterwards. That's when you start to think about how close you came to going under and all the emotions come welling up. As for Doc, he had also just killed a man. I know we like to envision our heroes as being made out of stone, but I think Clint Eastwood said it best in Unforgiven. It's a hell of a thing killing a man. Take away all he's got and all he's ever gonna have. I have no doubt that Holliday felt the exact same way. I'm sure he got over it rather quickly, but those tears were most likely serving as a sort of an exhaust valve, a way of letting loose all the strong emotions after engaging in mortal combat. I don't know about you, but one of my favorite scenes of all time is when Johnny Ringo and Doc Holliday squared off on the streets of Tombstone. You know the one. Ringo increasingly gets more and more erratic, screaming about playing for blood, until finally Doc steps from the shadows and says, "I'm your Huckleberry. That's just my game." But how exactly did this confrontation go down in real life? Was it really like they showed in the movie Tombstone, or was there more to it? And did Holliday ever actually say, "I'm your Huckleberry"? That's what we'll be discussing today, along with Doc's participation in the famous Earp Vendetta ride, his final gunfight in Colorado, and his untimely demise at Glenwood Springs. And yes, we'll also examine the various claims regarding Doc's grave. And stick around to the very end because I do get a little emotional answering a listener submitted question. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Yeehaw! In late January of 1882, Doc Holliday and Johnny Ringo came within mere seconds of turning the streets of Tombstone into a slaughterhouse. Story goes that Ringo approached Holliday and asked if he'd been talking about him, to which Doc replied, "Well, I don't know, but if I have, it still goes." Bystanders began to nervously step away as the two gunmen slowly inched their hands towards their revolvers. And then, just as it seemed that all hell was about to break loose, Acting Police Chief Jim Flynn intervened and placed both of them into custody. To quote historian Mark Lee Gardner, the Allen Street altercation became the greatest gunfight that never was. But the tension and fear of onlookers that day had been very real, mostly because of Doc's supposed fatalism. A Tombstone resident described Doc as a very hard character who carries his death warrant with him at all times. He is dying of consumption, and he is correspondingly reckless. End of quote. Now that's just one version of the confrontation. Another has it that Ringo initially challenged Wyatt Earp, and when Wyatt declined, that's when Doc stepped from the shadows with a, quote, cold little smile on his cadaverous face. Ringo then drew a handkerchief from his pocket, flipped a corner towards Holliday, and said, I don't need but 3 feet to do my fighting. Here's my handkerchief, take hold. And of course, that's when Doc uttered the now iconic phrase, I'm your Huckleberry, that's just my game. Now, just in case you're new here, I almost feel duty-bound to bring this up. But yes, Huckleberry is the correct phrase. I know it really doesn't make sense to our modern ears, but back in the 19th century, I'm your Huckleberry meant the same thing as saying I'm the right person for the job. You can find it in everything from newspaper articles to advertisements, even poems. By contrast, the term Hucklebearer is really nothing more than an internet rumor that went viral in the early 2000s. And just to be fair, we also don't know for certain whether or not the real Doc Holliday ever said, I'm your Huckleberry. He certainly would have known what it meant, but we just don't know for sure that he said it. And besides, there's just so many different versions of this standoff between Doc and Ringo that not only do we not know whether or not Doc said, I'm your Huckleberry, but we don't even know for sure how exactly it went down. All we know is the words were exchanged and that Doc, Ringo, and Wyatt Earp were placed under arrest for carrying concealed weapons. And even then, the charges against Wyatt were dismissed on account of him being a lawman. But yeah, to say that tensions were running high there in Tombstone in late January of 1882 would definitely be an understatement. Not even a full 3 months had passed since the gunfight at the OK Corral. A bitter struggle that saw the deaths of cowboys Frank and Tom McLaury and Billy Clanton. In turn, the remaining cowboys compiled a hit list and threatened to storm the town en masse. The raid never materialized, but they did manage to shoot Wyatt's brother Virgil on the night of December 28th, 1881. The then marshal had just left the Oriental Saloon when what he described as 3 double-barreled shotguns opened at a distance of about 60 feet. According to Earp biographer Casey Teffer-Tiller, quote, the blast came from between charred boards of a burned-out building across the street. As Virgil fell into the street, several men dashed out of the building, ran down Fifth, and disappeared into the darkness. Now, despite being horribly wounded, Virgil would survive, albeit without the use of his left arm. And then, just a few weeks later, is when Holliday had that famous showdown with Johnny Ringo. By the way, what you're hearing right now is the 4th and final installment in a series on Doc Holliday. If you'd like to learn all about Doc's early life, his friendship with Wyatt Earp, and his time in Tombstone, I would urge you to check out those 3 previous episodes, which I do have links to down below. A lot of links down below in this episode's description, so knock yourself out. And I know I mentioned this earlier in the series, but if it seems like I'm glossing over certain events, especially in regard to Wyatt Earp, don't worry because we will be discussing this all again, way more in depth, in the upcoming Wyatt Earp series. For today, though, we are going to focus mostly on Doc Holliday, who, as fate would have it, would join Wyatt in searching for the men who shot Virgil. The turn of events, oddly enough, that seemed to work wonders on Doc's health. Or as historian Gary Roberts put it, Doc's life had changed dramatically in the weeks since Virgil was shot. He had exchanged the smoke-filled saloons and gambling halls for the trail. At the very least, his participation in these posses suggested that his health was better than it had been. End of quote. Now, although Doc and Wyatt were initially unsuccessful, they did apply enough pressure to force Ike Clanton and his brother Phineas to turn themselves in. They'd stand trial for shooting Virgil in early February, but much to the Earps' dismay, they were ultimately acquitted. And then, of course, on March 18th is when they, or some of their fellow cowboys, murdered Wyatt's other brother, Morgan. Morgan had been playing billiards over at the Campbell and Hatch Saloon when an assassin's bullet tore through his back. And just like with the shooting of Virgil, the triggermen simply disappeared into the night. And you know what happens next, right? The famous Wyatt Earp vendetta ride. I see a red sash, I kill the man wearing it. Now, granted, the cowboys didn't actually wear red sashes, but the sentiment remains. Wyatt Earp had reached a breaking point, and if the courts weren't going to bring the cowboys to heel, then by God, he'd just start dishing out a little frontier justice of his own. And you better believe Doc Holliday was right there with him. Their first target was an old boy by the name of Frank Stillwell. Wyatt and a small posse caught up with Frank at the train depot over in Tucson. Ike Clanton was there as well, but he had taken off running just like he had done back in Tombstone. I ran straight for Stillwell, Wyatt would later recall. What a coward he was. He couldn't shoot when I came near him. He stood there helpless and trembling for his life. As I rushed upon him, he put out his hands and clutched my shotgun. I let go both barrels, and he tumbled down dead and mangled at my feet. I started for Clanton then, but he escaped behind a moving train of cars. End of quote. Moments later, Holliday and several others arrived there on the scene, and they too emptied their guns into Stillwell's body. So much so that an eyewitness would later describe Frank as being the worst shot-up man he had ever seen. Then, just a few days later, they did the same to a cowboy known as Indian Charlie. He too was suspected in taking part in Morgan's assassination, so Wyatt and the others left him dead in the dirt. Now, that particular killing took place on March 21st, 1882. Skip ahead to the 24th, and Wyatt and the posse rode straight into an ambush. According to Holliday, quote, "We approached a spring which was situated in a holler. As we did so, 8 rustlers rose up from behind the bank and poured from 35 to 40 shots into us. Our escape was miraculous. The shots cut our clothing and saddles and killed 1 horse, but did not hit us. I think we would have all been killed if God Almighty wasn't on our side." End of quote. Now, as it turns out, the guys that ambushed them were also Cochise County cowboys, same people they were hunting. And rather than run, Wyatt simply dismounted, took aim with his shotgun, and sent a load of buckshot into the chest of cowboy leader Curly Bill Brocious. Probably. Full disclosure, but there is a little bit of a debate as to whether or not Earp truly killed Curly Bill Brocious. I'm not going to get into it today. We'll discuss that later on with the Earp series. But the death, or the alleged death of Curly Bill, did pretty much mark the end of the so-called vendetta ride. By this point, Wyatt, Doc, and the others were all wanted for the murder of Frank Stillwell, so rather than press their luck, they instead headed east for New Mexico. First to Silver City, then Deming, and finally Albuquerque. In fact, it's there in Albuquerque where Wyatt and Doc had a falling out of sorts. Not much in the way of details, but according to Big Nose Kate, Doc had accused Wyatt of wearing a steel shirt, sort of like an Old West version of a bulletproof vest. And he said that Wyatt wasn't taking the same chances as he and the others were. Believe it or not, this is somewhat corroborated. Hell, according to Billy Breckenridge, even some of the cowboys who were at Iron Springs, where Brocious was killed, also said that Wyatt was wearing some type of a steel shirt. Earp, of course, would later deny the allegations, stating that it was just another one of Billy's damned lies. The other version of the rift between Earp and Holliday comes from Miguel Otero in 1940. Yes, 1940, over half a century after the fact, so grain of salt. But yeah, according to Mr. Otero, Doc told Wyatt that he was turning into a quote-unquote Jew boy. I'm not making this up, I promise. Supposedly, this was in reference to Josephine Marcus, who Earp had taken a shine to back in Tombstone. Which does sort of make sense, as Josephine was indeed Jewish. In fact, when Wyatt died in 1929, he'd even be buried in a Jewish cemetery. Now, that said, Wyatt did stay at the home of a prominent businessman there in Albuquerque named Henry Hoffa, or Henry Jaffa, who also was Jewish. So, who knows, man? Maybe that's what caused Holliday to make such an off-color remark. Per historian Mark Lee Gardner, quote, "Whatever it was that caused the falling out between Wyatt and Doc, it's important to remember that these two friends have spent more time together in the last month than in all of the last 5 years. Even the best of friends can get on each other's nerves after a certain amount of time in close contact. And this particular time was stressful, as Wyatt wasn't yet sure where they would go or what the future held. However, one quarrel generally doesn't end a deep friendship, and Doc brushed the spat aside when asked about it a few weeks later. We had a little misunderstanding, Doc told a reporter, but it didn't amount to much." End of quote. Now, the posse would eventually head north to Trinidad, Colorado before finally splitting up. Wyatt and a few of the others pressed on to Gunnison as Doc headed to South Pueblo to do a little gambling. And it's there in Pueblo where he had a very strange encounter with a guy by the name of Perry Mallon. Supposedly, Mallon had recognized Doc and made up some weird story about Frank Stillwell's brother also being in town and that he was gunning for him. He then showed Doc scars that he claimed to have received in previous gunfights and told Doc that he'd kill him if he said anything about it. Like I said, weird, right? Now, Holliday, being the street-savvy sort that he was, just brushed Mallon off as being a nut job. Little did he know, however, how much of an impact Mallon would have on his immediate future. You see, not long thereafter, Doc headed north to Denver to take in the races. And no sooner had he stepped off the train when Mallon came scurrying out of the shadows with a pair of six-shooters, telling Doc to throw his hands up. A couple of deputies soon noticed the commotion and took Doc into custody. Now, this would end up being a pretty huge debacle. According to Mallon, he was a sheriff out of California who had spent the last 7 years tracking down Holliday after he had killed his partner. He also said that Doc had shot him no less than 6 times, and he even had a missing finger to prove it. Now, obviously, this was all bullshit. Turns out Mallon was nothing more than a 2-bit con artist. He'd even be arrested a couple of months later in Ohio for pulling a similar type stunt. Nevertheless, Doc was in quite the pickle. Mallon's lies notwithstanding, he was still wanted for murder down in Arizona. And now that he was behind bars, he was under the very real threat of extradition. Luckily for him, that's when his old friend Bat Masterson intervened on his behalf. First by having a lawyer file a writ of habeas corpus, and then by concocting some bogus charges. It's worth noting that at this point, Bat was serving as town marshal over in Trinidad. So all he really had to do was pull some strings with a colleague of his down in Pueblo. Once again, per historian Mark Lee Gardner, quote, on the afternoon of May 17th, South Pueblo's city marshal appeared at the Denver jail with a warrant for Doc's arrest, charging him with robbing a mark of $150 in a confidence game. By law, local charges took precedent over charges beyond state lines. It was a smart move orchestrated by Bat to keep Doc from being sent to Arizona. End of quote. Nevertheless, Doc would spend another 2 weeks behind bars in Denver before finally being taken to Pueblo to answer for that bogus charge, at which point he posted a $300 bond and walked out a free man. As far as him and Wyatt and the other posse men being extradited, this would soon be squashed by then Colorado Governor Frederick Pitkin, and that was pretty much the end of it. So long as they kept their asses out of Arizona, they really didn't have to worry about being arrested over the murder of Frank Stillwell. Now, just as soon as Doc was released, he joined Wyatt up in Gunnison, where his fate would have it, he set for the rare interview with a local paper. When asked about the gunfight at the OK Corral, Holliday stated, quote, one day 6 of the cowboys came into town and proposed to run it. The Earps were informed of their doings, and they invited me to go over where the cowboys were. One of the Earps said, throw your hands up, we have come to disarm you. Instead of putting up their paws, they put up their revolvers and began firing. 3 of them were killed on the spot and 2 of the Earps wounded. I received a slight wound on the hip, which caused me some inconvenience for a few days. End of quote. Now later on that July, Wyatt and his brother Warren headed west to California, and Doc set out for Leadville. That said, there was something else that occurred that very same month that I do think deserves a little attention. And that something is the death of Johnny Ringo. Johnny's body was discovered on July 14th, about 40 or so miles north of Tombstone. And despite his death initially being ruled a suicide, even to this day there are many who think there's a little more involved than meets the eye. And for good reason. I mean, there's a lot of very weird stuff surrounding Ringo's death, including the fact that a portion of his scalp was missing and that he was wearing his cartridge belt upside down. There's even some who think that Doc Holliday was the true killer. Here's the thing, though. We know for a fact that Doc was in Pueblo in early July fighting extradition. And then on July 16th, just 2 days after Ringo's body was discovered, Doc checked into a hotel room up in Gunnison. So the idea that he somehow slipped down to Tombstone completely unseen, killed Ringo, and then rushed north over 700 miles to Gunnison in time to create an alibi just doesn't seem all that feasible. Especially considering Ringo's state of mind. I've got an entire episode on this as well if you're interested in learning more, but Johnny was really going through it at the time of his death. Not only drinking heavily, but openly discussing his own imminent demise. So the idea of him taking himself out really doesn't come as much of a shock. But yeah, like I said a minute ago, it wasn't long after Ringo's death when Holliday moved on to Leadville, a town that historian Casey Teffer-Tiller described as, quote, literally a field of dreams. The real boom began in 1877 when silver was discovered, and by 1880, Leadville was the queen of the silver camps, boasting a population of 40,000 people and a monthly mining payroll of $800,000. More than a few millionaires walked the town's busy streets as fair game for the sporting crowd, who soon found the hunting good. At its heyday, Leadville boasted 120 saloons, 118 gambling halls, 110 beer gardens, and 35 brothels. End of quote. In other words, Doc Holliday had plenty of opportunities to ply his trade. The only problem was the climate, or more specifically, the elevation. Now, me personally, I've never been to Leadville, but I have been to other parts of Colorado. Denver, at around 5,000 feet, really didn't bother me. But I was definitely huffing and puffing when I paid a visit to Lookout Mountain, where Buffalo Bill Cody's buried. And Leadville is damn near 3,000 feet higher than Lookout Mountain. So for somebody like Doc Holliday, already struggling to breathe on account of the tuberculosis, such a drastic change in elevation, coupled with the much lower average temperatures, really wasn't all that good for his health. Matter of fact, back in the day, they even used to make promotional brochures warning consumptives not to visit Leadville. One such brochure stated in part, quote, "Persons troubled with weak lungs or heart disease should give the new camp a wide berth." Now, that said, Holliday did seem to prosper, at least initially. He began dealing faro at the Monarch Saloon, played a little poker on the side, and quickly became acquainted with the local high rollers. He even helped to put out a fire at a gambling joint later on that December. And by the following spring, he was back in Dodge City, taking part in a little something known as the Dodge City War. Maybe. I've discussed the Dodge City War on previous episodes. Not really going to go too in depth on it today, but it's centered around a gambler by the name of Luke Short. Luke was being pushed out of town by the powers that be, and rather than tuck tail and run, he instead called on a few of his buddies to come to his assistance. Guys like Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, Charlie Bassett, and possibly even our very own Doc Holliday. And it worked. Not only did Short come out on top, but he and his buddies did so without firing a single shot. The only question is, was Doc Holliday really involved? Truth is, we just don't know. While this was a very dramatic affair and covered extensively in the press, historians do cast doubt as to whether or not Doc was actually there in person. The only real evidence we have are several articles announcing his arrival, but even then, it's thought that this was more of a intimidation tactic as opposed to proof of him being there in the flesh. What's more, guys like Earp and Masterson never even once spoke of Doc's participation. In other words, to quote historian Gary Roberts, whether or not Doc Holliday was actually one of Wyatt Earp's fighters, the Short faction did make excellent use of his reputation. Now that said, there is a bit of corroboration from one of Wyatt's nieces, who did recall him and Doc paying her family a visit around the same period, so who knows. Maybe Doc Holliday took part in the Dodge City War, and maybe he didn't. But what we do know is that he was back in Leadville later on that summer, and unfortunately, he really wasn't doing all that well. Not only was Doc self-medicating with laudanum and whiskey, but he was also suffering from continued bouts of pneumonia, a condition that made it next to impossible to hold down steady employment. And then on top of all of that, he got some devastating news from back home regarding his cousin Maddie. Turns out she had changed her name and joined a convent. Now, if you'll recall, she and Doc had allegedly been lovebirds when they were teenagers. In fact, there are some who think that it was rejection from Maddie that caused Doc to head west in the first place. And now, with her becoming a nun, he'd be forced to give up any lingering hopes he may have had in regard to marriage. Speaking of marriage, you may be wondering whatever happened to Big Nose Kate. Well, as far as I'm aware, she was still living in Arizona. And don't worry, we'll talk more about Kate later on, including whether or not she was at Doc's side during his final moments. For now, though, we're still in the fall of 1884. And in addition to his declining health and a possible broken heart, Holliday was also experiencing quite a bit of difficulty with his old enemy, Johnny Tyler. Yeah, the same Johnny Tyler from Tombstone. Christ almighty, it's like I'm sitting here playing poker with my brother's kids or something. Now, apparently Tyler and several of his friends there in Leadville had seized upon Doc's turn for the worse and started harassing him, pretty much just trying to goad him into a fight. To quote historian Gary Roberts, it was when Doc was fragile, broke, and down on his luck that Johnny Tyler and his crowd began to prod Doc in every way they could, hoping to provoke an incident or humiliate him publicly. End of quote. And then, just to make things worse, Doc owed a whopping $5 to one of Tyler's buddies, bartender by the name of Billy Allen. And when Doc failed to pay off the debt in a timely manner, Allen started making threats. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is Doc Holliday we're talking about, so why didn't he just pull out his gun and start blasting? Well, first of all, this is real life, not a Western. And as we've already discussed, he really wasn't doing all that well health-wise. He was also still worried about being extradited back to Arizona, which I do think was a very real possibility had he gotten too far out of line. Hell, he wasn't even allowed to carry a gun. Local police knew all about his past, so they'd routinely stop and frisk him just to make sure he wasn't packing heat. So, that being the case, Doc just did his level best to avoid a fight, even to the point of asking the police for help. The same police that were so concerned about him not being able to defend himself. He told them on numerous occasions that there was a plot to kill him, and when they refused to act, he turned to the press. Quote, I am afraid to defend myself, and these cowards kick me because they know I am down. I haven't a cent, have few friends, and they will murder me yet before they are done. And just to give you an idea of the sort of abuse that Doc was taking, Tyler and Alan and all their friends, they were just basically following him around nonstop, harassing him. They'd insult him to his face, they'd threaten to whoop his ass, tell him to go for a gun that they knew he didn't have, shit like that. But you can only push a man so far, right? We've all got our breaking point, and I reckon Doc experienced his on the evening of August 19th, 1884. He had gotten word that Alan was once again looking for him, saying that he was going to kick his brains out if he didn't have his money. And rather than hide, Doc had a confidant sneak a pistol over to Hyman's saloon and hide it under the bar. Not long thereafter, Holliday stepped inside and situated himself so he could see the front door. And then when Billy Allen stepped inside is when Holliday reached under the bar, grabbed that pistol, and commenced to shooting. Now, in a perfect world, he would have shot Allen deader in hell. But remember what I said earlier about this not being a Western. In all reality, Doc missed the first shot, but his second managed to shatter Billy's right arm. And then, just as he thumbed back the hammer for shot number 3, is when he was restrained by the bartender. Doc was arrested, at which point he claimed self-defense, stating that the $5 debt was, quote, just a pretext. It is the old trouble, and Allen was picked out to be the man to kill me. In other words, he felt like Tyler had put Allen on the hit due to their previous difficulties in Tombstone. Now, believe it or not, Doc would end up spending nearly a month in jail before they finally lowered his bond enough for him to secure release. The trial wouldn't occur until late March 1885, and following a lengthy deliberation, he was acquitted of all charges. You often hear that Holliday was run out of town following this most recent shooting, but from what I can tell, that does not seem to be the case. He may have possibly made a trip down to New Orleans a month after his acquittal, where he supposedly had a reunion with his father. But by later on that June, he was back in Leadville, where he ironically used a revolver of his own to collect on an old debt. Story goes that a gambler known as Curly Mac owed Doc $50. And it just so happened that Doc was on hand one night when Mac won it big at the faro table. Per the June 12th, 1885 edition of the Aspen Times, quote, just as Curly was about to cash in, his creditor, Doc Holliday, stepped to one side so that Curly couldn't see him. And drawing a 6-shooter from his waistband of his pants, he coolly remarked, I'd like that 50 tonight, Curly. When the player looked up and saw the muzzle of the gun and the cold, hard face of Doc with his determined expression, he shoved the whole pile of chips over and said, take 'em all. Doc counted out his $50 and pushed the others back to the winner and walked out. And that settled it. End of quote. Now, that said, by this point, it does look like Doc was itching to travel, so he went ahead and headed north to Butte, Montana. He was there in January of 1886, where he allegedly pulled a pistol on a man and, quote, made him dance a quick step because he had befriended him, and the latter failed to reciprocate. End of quote, and okay, it's a weird situation. Unfortunately, no other details remain, but there was a warrant issued for his arrest, and I guess the authorities felt like he was too sick to be taken into custody, so they let him be temporarily. And then just a couple of days later, he snuck on a train bound for Denver. And yeah, it was there in Denver where he experienced 2 very notable encounters with a pair of ghosts from his past. First came when he bumped into an old associate from Tombstone, Milt Joyce. You may remember Joyce as being the bartender who Holliday shot in the hand. And when I say Doc bumped into him, I meant that literally. According to Joyce, he was leaving a barbershop when Doc walked up and gave him a shoulder check. Or as Joyce put it, he came along the edge of the crowd and brushed against me. At first, Joyce just continued walking, but I guess Doc's insolence got to gnawing on him. Once again, per Joyce, quote, when I got halfway to the hotel, a thought struck me that maybe he imagined that I was afraid of him. Turning on my heel, I walked back and looked for him till I found him in the saloon where he hung out. I deliberately brushed against him, the same he had against me. I looked at him and he looked at me, but neither of us spoke a word. I walked around him 3 times, just to give him a chance if he wanted it, and to remove any idea he might have that I wanted to run away. He didn't look at all scared, but he wasn't looking for any more trouble. End of quote. The second encounter came in the form of none other than Wyatt Earp. Apparently, Wyatt and his bride were living over in Aspen, and they'd occasionally take trips to Denver. According to Josephine, it was on one such visit when they met up with Holliday. Quote, Doc came over and chatted with us for a few minutes. Then he and Wyatt walked away, Doc on visibly unsteady legs. My husband was deeply affected by this parting from the man who, like an ailing child, had clung to him as though to derive strength from him. There were tears in Wyatt's eyes when at last they took leave of each other. Doc threw his arms across his shoulder and said, Goodbye, old friend. It will be a long time before we meet again. He turned and walked away as fast as his feeble legs would permit. End of quote. So yeah, once again, Doc really not doing well by this point. Even worse than he had been a year prior in Leadville. Nevertheless, he would continue traveling throughout the spring of 1886, first to Pueblo and then west to Silverton, and by the time he made it back to Denver, they were cracking down on gambling, so he returned to Leadville. He spent another miserable winter there, working at Hyman's Saloon, and come spring is when he took a stage some 80 or so miles northwest to the town of Glenwood Springs. Now, if you're not familiar, Glenwood Springs was named after the nearby sulfur springs that the Ute tribe believed had curative powers. And really, this was no different from when Doc spent time at the various other hot springs in places like New Mexico and Arizona. Only this time, the consumption was far more advanced. He was only able to continue supporting himself for about another 4 months, mostly dealing faro and doing a little bartending, before he finally came down with yet another case of pneumonia. And this time, sadly, there would not be a recovery. Doc was bedridden for over a month, at times delirious and slipping in and out of a coma, until finally, at around 10 a.m. on the morning of November 8th, 1887, the great John Henry Holliday went on to his eternal reward. Now, you may be curious as to whether or not Doc Holliday really uttered those famous last words of his. This is funny. Well, I really can't say for certain, but the only source for that is Walter Noble Burns, and nobody knows exactly where Burns got the information. According to Mark Lee Gardner, Burns, quote, did research his subjects thoroughly, but he is also known to have embellished and created dialogue in his works. Doc may have never said this, but without additional evidence, the possibility that he did say it should not be dismissed. End of quote, and there you have it. Now, Big Nose Kate would later claim to have been present at the time of Holliday's death, but once again, she really isn't considered to be all that reliable of a source. Even Josephine Earp would later claim that she and Wyatt visited Doc when he was dying, but once again, to quote historian Mark Lee Gardner, there's no evidence of such a visit, no reports in the local newspaper of the presence of the famed Wyatt Earp in town. It may never have happened. Even so, it's the ending we want. End of quote. And yeah, I really do like that idea of Wyatt and Doc seeing one another for one final time there at Glenwood Springs, but once again, we just don't know that it happened. That last meeting they had in Denver may have been the last time they saw one another. There's just so much we don't know about Doc Holliday, and it gets a little frustrating at times. Hell, even his final resting place remains a mystery. If you've ever paid a visit to his grave in Glenwood Springs, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that may not be the exact location of his burial. And there's actually a lot of debate over this. As far as I'm aware, all of the contemporary sources do list him as being buried there in the Linwood Cemetery. And while I do think that's likely, not everyone agrees. For example, that big stone that currently marks Doc's grave, that wasn't donated by the town of Glenwood Springs until 1956. And according to the then city manager, it was one of the town's old-timers who pointed out the spot where Doc was buried some 69 years prior. But then again, there were at least 3 other old-timers who stated otherwise. One said that Holliday was buried in what's now a residential area. Another said he's buried on the corner of 9th and Palmer. And another said that his coffin was washed away and had to be reburied at a different location. There's also the story of him being temporarily buried at the foot of the hill on account of the ground being frozen. And then once it was warm enough to reinter him, everybody had already forgotten where he was buried. Now, if I'm not mistaken, that last story I said about the ground being frozen, that has been debunked as new evidence shows that several bodies were indeed buried on the hill the very same week as Holliday's death. And if all this isn't confusing enough, there are others still who maintain that Holliday's body was returned to Georgia at the request of his father. And then when his daddy died in 1893, he was buried next to his boy. Is there any truth to that? Who knows? Like I said, so much of Doc's life, including his death, still remains a mystery. Now, as far as his cousin Maddie, or as she was known later in life, Sister Mary Melanie, she survived Doc by over half a century, passing away in 1939 at the age of 88. If you've ever seen the movie Gone with the Wind, it was supposedly Maddie Holliday who inspired the character of Melanie Hamilton. And by the way, this next part really chaps my hide. But even though Maddie and Doc stayed in touch for years after he had headed west, all of his letters were later destroyed, either by Maddie or her sister following her death. A very, very frustrating turn of events, as those letters would be a literal gold mine for historians. But I guess that's just sometimes how the cookie crumbles. Big Nose Kate Elder would go on to marry an English blacksmith by the name of George Cummins. And aside from a few years in Colorado, she spent most of her remaining days in Arizona. She died there in 1940 at the age of 90 at a pioneer's home in Prescott. As for Doc's good friend Wyatt Earp, well, we'll discuss what that old rascal got up to here in the next few weeks.